Good.
Started.
All right, so while the audience is joining us for today's lunch talk, I wanted to remind you of the events at the Center of Philosophy of Science next week. On Tuesday at noon, Reid von Bork, who is a Center Fellow and a postdoc at the Center this year, is going to be talking about a causal interpretation of measurement models in psychology. On Friday next week, there is no lunchtime talk, but we have the second lecture of the annual lecture series this semester at 3:30 p.m. And it's going to be given by Hélène Landry from UC Davis. And she will be talking about as-ifism, mathematics method without metaphysics. If you're interested by any of these two talks, please go to the center's website and look for the calendar. And on the calendar, you can find links to register for these talks, both of which will happen on Zoom, as we are now used to. So we hope to see some of you for these lectures. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ryan Nefdt, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and an affiliated faculty in the Department of Linguistics at University Cape Town. Ryan is also a Center Fellow this semester. Ryan worked in the philosophy of language, philosophy of linguistics, cognitive science, and philosophy of science, as well as African philosophy. He got his PhD in 2016 from the University of St. Andrews, and he has published widely in issues related to the philosophy of linguistics, to the foundations of linguistics, and to the methods in linguistics in both philosophy journals such as Synthèse and Inquiry, Review of Philosophy and Psychology, and as well as more linguistic journals such as Language Sciences and the Journal of Logic, Language, and Information. And he's working on, or is about to work on, two books, one on how to understand linguistics and a shorter one for Cambridge. So we're actually looking forward to these two books in the coming years. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Yeah, the book projects are being fueled quite a bit by the workshop at Pittsburgh. And if it survives the gauntlet, then I think there'll be something worthwhile at the end. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now and try to, there we go. Okay, so my plan for today is to talk about structures in the special sciences, and with a special focus on the case of linguistics. This is the larger book project that I have related to structural realism as an interpretation of linguistics as a science. So this is some rough, but some less so, hopefully, ideas on the subject. So I'll start by listing my plan for the talk. The first part of the talk is going to be a little bit of a structural realist sales pitch that many in the philosophy of science would be quite used to and familiar with. And maybe some other people are not, so I hope to do that sales pitch justice. And then I want to outline the problem of pessimistic meta-induction or radical theory change from the philosophy of science literature, but I want to make a special case for it in linguistics. And then I'm going to use some historical cases of what I consider to be mathematical continuity over various epochs of the generative tradition, at least. And finally, use that to make a more positive case for structural realism in generative linguistics. Okay, so of course, many of us know that the history of linguistics bears witness, and the history of science bears witness to a number of radical theory changes. Loudon in 1981 was one of, not the first, but one of the most prominent describers of the situation that's now known as pessimistic meta-induction, which is this deep problem that we see across the passage of time. And you can sum that problem up by considering the following kind of statement. If all or most previous scientific theories have been shown to be false of the real world, then what reason do we have to believe in the truth of our current theories? And this, of course, is especially a problem for anyone who wants to hold on to some sort of scientific realism. Now, the other options that we have immediately, we could say, well, false theories can be responsible for true theories on some sort of trial and error basis, and there's some sort of cumulative knowledge. I think we want to hold on to such a view. But the idea that our best current theories have some sort of instrumental value for later truth is really tough for some to swallow. And then if you adopt a different sort of constructive empiricist notion that we just need our science to get the observables right, that too comes with a host of well-known philosophical problems. And one important thing is that if we do accept one of these other options, we get to this worry that at no point will certainty naturally force itself upon us, since success by itself isn't a guarantee of truth. And the most common example of this is the use of classical mechanics, even though many people consider the theory to have been superseded, various calculations and equations are still useful for various practices. So the success of our best theories surely cannot be miraculous on this view. And this is the point at which usually we get the structural realists entering the fray. And what they say is, so between the PMI, the pessimistic meta-induction, and the no miracles argument, this idea that we can't make a miracle of the success of science, we need to find a middle ground. And that middle ground is what structural realism offers us, starting with Worrell, who had an epistemic version of structural realism, which says that we can only know the properties and relations that pertain in the unobservable world, to what I will be talking about a little bit more now, ontic structural realism. Because the epistemic variety doesn't make it entirely clear as to how we escape the PMI, according to many, such as Stephen French and James Ladyman, since what we're interested in is what is ontologically retained across theories, not just our knowledge of it. So Ladyman has this very influential paper in '98 that sort of started the ontic structural realist movement. And he says there, rather we should adopt the structural realist emphasis on the mathematical or structural content of our theories, since there is, says Worrell, retention of structure across theory change. Structural realism both avoids the force of the pessimistic meta-induction by not committing us to the belief in the theory's description of the universe or the world, and B, does not make the success of science seem miraculous by committing us to the claim that the theory structure over and above its empirical content describes the world. But as you see in the literature on structural realism, it's not just good enough to say that structure is preserved across theories. You kind of have to show it. And Ladyman 2011 does an excellent job of showing that structure was retained from the almost canonical case of an empty theory, phlogiston theory, to Lavoisier's oxygen theory. French makes a similar case to extend ontic structural realism beyond physics and chemistry to biology. And here he uses an analogy with systems biology, where you abstracting from individual organisms and you're actually looking at the basic or primitive ontological unit of biology being a system that comprises the environment and individual organisms interacting with each other. And here, my purpose is to show that linguistics is particularly susceptible to this kind of analysis. So what is structural realism or ontic structural realism? Let me say a little bit more about the framework. The common slogan is something like, structure is all there is. But of course, such a claim is metaphysically tendentious. Not in the least because structure is viewed set theoretically or in terms of category theory or graph theory. There are some views of it in terms of those formalisms. It's mathematical in nature. Structures are mathematical in nature. And it's unclear if we want to say that OSR is committed to the view that the world is mathematical, is a mathematical structure. Certainly not. And then certain views that have been proffered to connect the mathematical with the physical through partial morphisms of some sort. You worry that how those isomorphisms, partial isomorphisms, are related. They relate to structures, and then you're assuming that the physical world is a structure along these lines as well. So this might be a problem already. And I worry, given about the sort of ambit, the ambitious ambit of the project, do we really have to say that structures are all there is? So there might be another way of talking about structural realism. And I think a better way of talking about it, or at least the way that I'd like to adopt, is understanding the claim as the claim that structures or relations are ontologically prior, and in some case primitive, to objects and properties. So this could again become a controversial claim because whether or not ontic structural realism is a prominent view in the philosophy of science and philosophy of physics, there's still a question as to whether it's applicable to fundamental physics, for instance. Ainsworth suggests that there is no purely relational interpretation of quantum mechanics, for instance. So the claim I want to advocate is slightly weaker than the strongest varieties of this that you get in Lederman and Ross, for instance, 2007. And I'll call this OSR light for now. So structures are prior to objects and properties in some special sciences. That's the claim I'd like to make. And then my specific claim is going to be that, that linguistics is one of those sciences. And you could think equivalently of this view as objects and properties are somehow derivative from relations or structures. Okay, so what's the challenge of such an endeavor? Well, my project has two important challenges. The first is one that might outstrip my abilities. So there's the genuine question of whether ontic structural realism really is the best ontology for fundamental physics, the non-special science. Then you might worry, given that challenge, can OSR be extended to the special sciences? Because some people consider the case of fundamental physics to be the strongest case in favor of ontic structural realism. So certainly if it's controversial in that case, then one might wonder whether or not it would work in the special sciences. But I actually have the view that despite appearances, these two challenges can come apart. So in other words, I think notwithstanding the answer to challenge one, you can still make a case for ontic structural realism in terms of challenge two. So it's not really the question of what ontic structural realism can do for the special sciences, but maybe what the special sciences can do for ontic structural realism. So I'm not going to be making a case for challenge one here, or taking that challenge on. For those radical proposals and detailed radical proposals, I think French 2014 is an place to start, and Lederman and Russ is another, ambitious project in that vein. But I'm going to take on challenge 2 here, at least for linguistics, as I'm following in a family of other similar proposals in the social sciences. Okay, so ontic structural realism and the special sciences. Here, Kincaid is quite useful in his description of what the rules of the game is. So how does one apply ontic structural realism to a special science, or in his case, economics and social sciences? So he argues that in order to successfully apply structural realism to the social sciences, one needs to show that social scientists talk about structures and not individuals, and that when this talk occurs, the individuals do not matter and the structures do. This seems like a priority claim, how I was interpreting structural realism in the first place. You could still admit objects into your ontology, but the the parts of the ontology that's doing the work are the relations and the structures. So in other words, if you show that social sciences emphasize roles and relations over and above individuals occupying those roles or standing in those relations, this counts in favor of the structural realist analysis. And this, if this sounds familiar for anyone who's encountered the debate in the philosophy of mathematics on structuralism, mathematical structuralism, you'll see these kinds of claims emerging from Shapiro and Resnick and others. This idea that the objects don't actually matter. There could be no objects, but the structure and the relations still stand. This view that you can differentiate between the positions in structures and the things that are occupying those positions, and you can define the former independently of the latter. So Cade, in his case, offers 3 cases for why economics meets that condition. So he suggests general claims about social structure, organizations, classes and groups, etc. The case of causal modeling, and equilibrium explanations, which involve self-consistent variables. I'm going to make a similar kind of move. I'm going to say there are general claims and frameworks like X-bar theory that allow us to focus on structures, and then I'm going to make some claims about individuals, like in the case of WH movement or passive transformations, in which it seems like structural considerations are paramount. Okay, so here we go. Some preliminaries. I'll be focusing mostly on the generative tradition. My larger project actually involves extending the structural analysis beyond generative grammar and connecting generative grammar to other formalisms. I'll speak a little bit about that here, but that's not the exact aim, partly because of time. And so the idea is that I'm going to focus on syntax as a proof of concept. And I'm going to flag later why that might be problematic in some ways. Okay, so why linguistics? Another motivating factor. Well, there's a long-standing critique that somehow generative linguistics is unscientific. Jackendorf makes a claim that parts of it, his inclusion there isn't that he thinks wholesale, because his parallel architecture is a version of generative grammar, but he considers the autonomy of syntax, for instance, to be a scientific mistake. Starkhoff and van Lambert, in a very controversial paper in Theoretical Linguistics, actually mount a much larger critique, and I've responded to that, and others have responded to the generalizations about the philosophy of science that seem problematic in that paper. And then, of course, others like Le Pen and Levine and Johnson claim that it's the theory change, precisely what I'm going to talk about, that has caused the problems for defining linguistics as a science. In fact, the paper, I think, is called The Structure of Unscientific Revolutions. So despite the successes of linguistics, of generative linguistics, it seems like radical theory change might have caused some problems for the fruitfulness of the field. And then the positive cases, I actually think you can follow Kincaid in showing that structure is more important than other considerations. Okay, so what I'm not going to do today, I can do it in the question session, is dispute the theory change claim. I think that is a claim that can be disputed, but I'm not going to do that today, so I'm just taking that on board. So what the talk is not about is about more preliminaries. It's not about sharing or subsumption. So there are many cases in which clearly earlier theories are consumed in later theories. Global derivational constraints seem to have been the basis for the idea of the trace theory of movement. But what I want to consider are more the cases in which there's a clear transition between structures. So if you take trace theory, for instance, that involved indices, multiple indices, to the copy theory of movement, which was a minimalist intervention to suggest that multiple objects were banned by the ontology. But I'm going to suggest that there's still some structural overlap. So here's, since I'm already down the rabbit hole, why not just define generative grammar itself? Of course, this is not an easy question to answer. Some hold that it started with Chomsky's 1957 syntactic structures and the so-called standard theory. I think the standard stories that linguistics of the 20th century, early 20th century, was more taxonomic with the structural linguists and anthropological. And there was a movement away from that towards formalization in even earlier papers, Chomsky 1956 already, away from stochastic modeling and things like that. Think of this as a much more complicated story. I've written about it, many other people have probably written better things. Of course, there's a long tradition of formalization from Bloomfield to Hockett to Harris to Bar-Hillel. So it's not clear that you can pinpoint an exact moment where this started. I mean, Bar-Hillel showed that a recursive grammar formalism was possible for French sentences. That was his chosen target. So maybe recursive generative grammar started then. But the formal revolution certainly did seem to draw its inspiration from mathematical logic and proof theory. So at the center of this is newly established discipline, partly based in Hilbert's metamathematics, and the focus on form. You had the syntactic engine, and the structures of this were revealed through modeling grammatical form. So theoretically, the field takes itself to be understanding some sort of human biological language endowment or a state of the mind brain. And this, of course, this view emerged more in 1965 where mentalism was officially established as the sort of default ontology for language. This touches on lots of issues that many people have discussed. What is a language? You get nominalist views. The view that we're just going to be talking about and assuming for now is conceptualism, because that's the part and parcel of generative grammar. But of course, there are pluralist alternatives and non-psychological realism that is not identifiable with Platonism as well. So for those who are interested, we can talk about ontological considerations a little bit later in terms of the foundational picture. But what are these theory changes that I've suggested? Well, some of the theory changes involve the initial reliance on proof theoretic techniques pioneered by Emil Post and others. Over time, these commitments have changed, I'm suggesting. Among other things, cognitive science was moved towards evolutionary biology, derivations for constraints, formalization was criticized at some stage, phrase structure to cyclic applications of merge and phrases. So a lot of theoretical commitments seem to have been changed and altered and developed along the way. Add to that, from the standard theory to the extended standard theory to government and binding to minimalism, there are still linguists working in each epoch. And I think that's what makes linguistics such an interesting case from the perspective of the philosophy of science, whether you're talking about Kuhnian revolutions and how science has progressed and what's retained. What's interesting in the linguistics case is that some linguists are still working squarely within the government and binding theory, and they didn't adopt minimalism, but they would consider themselves generative grammarians. Some linguistics textbooks freely assume X bar as the explicit formalism. So this seems to make a very interesting case for linguistic pessimistic meta-induction. So given significant theoretical change, you worry about the fruitfulness of the enterprise and its while discoveries are called into question. On the ontological side, you can worry about whether the theoretical posits are a little bit like phlogiston and they've abandoned their reference as theories have changed. So in early generative grammar, you get traces that are postulated that are left behind when words move from higher nodes in trees. And the copy theory suggests that actually no such traces are left behind, and you merely have copies of items. So what do we do? Do we abandon those previous objects? What about the explanatory successes of previous iterations? This is all to make a case for the fact that clearly something pessimistic-y, meta-induction-y is going on with the history of linguistics, the short history of linguistics. It's a little bit like a model, I think. So when you talk about a lot of these issues in the philosophy of science, you're dealing with hundreds of years of progress and change. And with linguistics, what the cool part is, I think you can look at that in a much more condensed state. So let me say a little bit about what a grammar is. So a grammar G is just a formal device used to model all the grammatical sentences. This is sort of syntactic, standard syntactic thoroughfare. I seem to have something there. Okay. So more precisely, you get G will generate a string W consisting of symbols from sigma if and only if it is possible to start with S, the start symbol, and produce W through some finite sequence of rule applications. To many people, this should sound a lot like natural deduction, and there are connections to natural deduction. So we can call the set of all strings that G can generate the language of G, and we can annotate it in the way that I suggest. Now, importantly for this kind of structure, you get this idea of decidability. So how do we compute decidability? We actually have this question, this membership question of what is in the set of grammatical sentences and what is generated by the rules and what isn't. And that becomes a very important aspect of generative grammar. Okay. So a language LG is decidable if G is a decidable grammar. This is the answer to the membership problem. Okay. So now we see in the standard theory that phrase structure was used to capture the natural language system. And in terms of syntax, the idea is that sentences are divided into these smaller units that can be moved around, fronted, and these are called phrases, and they're built up of smaller units called lexical items or terminals in the case of the grammar. So in our technical terms, we can say that we have these production rules starting from the start symbol, and the production rules I already provide here involve some sort of recursion where you can rewrite the items in terms of the start symbol being reintroduced. So we have A and B as a set of terminals here, and then the non-terminals, these are the phrases represented by capital letters. Okay. The usual way that these kinds of things are represented in linguistics textbooks is by means of trees. And trees look a little bit like that. That's just a very simple tree, a phrase structure tree. And you get rules from this that are represented in such a structure. So the start symbol, the sentence here, you can rewrite as a noun phrase and a verb phrase, or a verb phrase you can rewrite as a verb and a prepositional phrase. And then if you have the possibility of introducing a noun phrase or a verb phrase within the right-hand side, you get the recursive element. So for every sentence of the language, let's say it's English, there should be a rule that covers it. Now, importantly, passives and questions force us to move beyond the realm of pure phrase structure, which have nice computational characteristics, especially in terms of possibility and complexity. And this is a move partly inherited by the structural realists, the structural linguists who came before, who suggest that certain elements of sentences are displaced from their positions where they actually get a lot of their interpretation and properties. So in the case of who will Mary kiss, who has moved from a lower part in the tree to a higher part. Okay, that's one very quick gloss of what phrase structure is doing. And then you get with the extended standard theory of Jackendorf 1977 and Chomsky 1970, this more condensed notion, the structurally more condensed notion called X-bar theory. Now notice phrase structure grammars will have multiples, in fact, tons of individual rules for each language. So they'll actually multiply every time you give a new construction. But multiple branching, for instance, is cognitively taxing. And part of the remit of generative linguistics has always been to try to explain how a language user actually learns their first language. So you don't want to put too much structure in that view. X-bar only permits binary branching, and it only has 3 kinds of rules that get you all the structure that you had with the phrase structure before. But the extra postulate is this bar level which is represented in the diagram below. And of course, there's psycholinguistic research that was done to try to identify that bar level, and the success of that endeavor, I don't think, has ever achieved fruition, but the idea was that this is a real postulate of the theory. Enter government and binding with Chomsky in 1991, and the tide in linguistics changes somewhat. Now, linguistics since 1965 still seem to be, it was established as a subset of psychology, and that still seems to be the predominant picture, but both formalization and heavy-duty formal language theory, the kinds of stuff I was talking about with the decidability of grammars and Chomsky hierarchy and things like that, were considered unproductive. They were dismissed as only concerning weak generative capacity, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now the language faculty is modeled on as this collection of 7 distinct causally separate modules. And the move here also involved a move towards these universal principles and parameters, which I can talk about a little bit in the question session, but the idea is that there's sort of these universal principles that the language faculty has, and individual parametric settings based on individual languages. And you get, as when you're learning the language, these parameters get set. So if English forces a subject on you, so if you want to say something about the rain, you have to say it is raining, the extended projection principle. Spanish won't make you do that, and that's a parametric setting. Why? The story I like, and this is mostly a caricature, is that, and this I think is a nice structural picture as well, that this idea that if there's a Martian linguist who comes to Earth, this Martian is not actually going to see individual languages, because again, on borders like Germany and the Netherlands, you'll have languages that are considered distinct, but actually very similar and mutually intelligible. But what this Martian is going to see is a structural picture, sort of one human language, Chomsky likes to say. Jeff Pullum has responded to that, and at least to me personally, saying that if that Martian linguist went back to the University of Mars, he's unlikely to get tenure with such a view. But the joke of the matter, or the anecdote, is that there's something structural about language, and there's structure that's shared across languages, and that might be something that can be abstracted in a linguistic theory. And then lastly, we get this move in 1995, or a little bit earlier actually, to minimalism. And again, the agenda is reset. Of course, people are saying minimalism isn't a theory so much as a program, but language is now reconceived as some sort of biologically natural object, and principles of economy, optimality, simplicity are privileged over all the modules of like government and binding and things like that. So instead of asking how much structure is needed, we ask how little structure is needed to ensure that language evolved. And the answer to this is something like the merge operation, which is the minimal bit of structure that you need to generate all linguistic output. I'll be very quick here to say that merge takes 2 syntactic units and combines them into a labeled unit. And instead of phrase structure, now we identify these cyclic phases of the merge operation, starting from lexical units. I'll give a quick example to say, so the sentence like, the author will write furiously, you start up in this bottom-up fashion, which people also suggest was a theoretical change from top-down phrase structure. And you merge write with furiously, and that forms a VP verb phrase. Then you take this union and you mix it with, or you merge it with the auxiliary will, and you get the tense phrase. And then you merge that, you merge independently the and author to create a noun phrase, which will give you the final tense phrase. Okay. And Freuden suggests that this is quite interesting because it seems like exactly the same structural picture as you got with generalized transformations in early generative grammars. What about just to flag a potential problem here? Many, such as Pullum and Schultz 2001, Pullum 2013, and Jackendorf even in 2018, suggest that there might have been a shift in the underlying mathematical structure. And such a thing would be a problem for anyone like me who's trying to say that mathematical structure is what's preserved. So if we look at it in terms of the membership problem, you get this idea that what I mentioned before when I defined a grammar were these proof theoretic grammars. And the question was whether or not that string can be generated from a start symbol in the production rules. But later on, even in government and binding, this notion of strings being recursively enumerable is abandoned for more constraint-based grammars where an expression fulfills a constraint set by the grammars, a little bit like axioms of the system. I think I have a quote. Model theoretic syntax, this is the alternative view that Pullum alleges comes from the model theoretic side of logic as opposed to the proof theoretic side, does not recursively define a set of expressions, it merely states the necessary conditions on the syntactic structures of individual expressions. So this seems like a mathematical shift. So I need to explain why I think that it's possible to still talk about structural continuity in the face of this. And I'm going to identify a few structural components. So all of the previous accounts assumed some sort of hierarchy as essential to syntactic representation. In addition to hierarchical structures where phrases are built up from smaller phrases, you have this generative idea of a finite set of rules defined as an infinite set of structures, which is also maintained. So with the model theoretic case, you still get the same sentences being generated. This is the idea of weak generative capacity. And you still get this idea that as you get with HBSG, for instance, head-driven phrase structure grammar in the introduction, SAG et al. Define their model theoretic syntax as taking a finite input and generating an infinite output, which is the same kind of Humboldtian move that Chomsky made. And we still represent these things hierarchically through tree structures. So I think that these properties are not trivial. So for instance, dependency grammars can be shown to be weakly equivalent to phrase structure, but are represented in terms of flat structures. They are no hierarchies. And then maybe pure model theoretic grammars, you have this idea that cardinality commitments don't work, but cardinality is an essential part of generative grammars. Okay, so in other words, the way I'm trying to get around this problem is to say that actually identifies some of the structural components that I suggest is what has been maintained through minimalism. And maybe hardline model theoretic grammars are slightly different mathematically, but I actually have a separate argument for why I think we can deal with those. Okay, so moving on. Getting back to Kincaid's analysis. So remember, he suggested that we have to have these general considerations that structures are considered over individuals. And here the general claims are things like phrases that take individuals and move them around in such a way that the precise nature of the individuals are not always considered. So you take something like a determinate phrase, and you can really put almost in the sort of Hilbertian move, you can put almost anything in that if it occupies the right kind of position in the structure, is my controversial claim. X bar, for instance, and trees and operations on trees are clearly structural in this general sense. Then, of course, you get the specific case of structural analyses like positing of covert structure and the example I gave a little bit earlier of movement. These are specific cases where structure seems to matter more than individuals. And then an essential component of generative grammar across these time slices seems to be brought out by this possibility that items move from one position in a tree. And this doesn't seem to be motivated on the basis of the profile of the individual, but rather on what the structural constraints of the grammar are. Okay, so I promised I would try to deal with Pullum and Schultz's worry a little bit later. And I think the way to do that is to get mathematical for a moment. So so the way in which I think those kinds of worries about model theory versus proof theory can be dealt with is just by looking at how they can actually generate the same sets of structures. So the same formal languages can be generated and composed through generative enumerative grammars and model theoretic ones. And these are results that were proven by Bucci and others, who show that you can actually use weak monadic second order logic to create aspects of the Chomsky hierarchy. Specifically, Bucci showed that a set of strings forms a regular language if and only if it can be defined in weak second order theory of the natural numbers with a successor, and then this was expanded on by others. So this is just to say that they are model theoretic means of defining what were considered to be purely proof theoretic structures. And in fact, Chomsky at one stage even considers model theory and proof theory, or derivations and representations, the way he talks about it, as notational variants of one another, because you can use alternative mathematics to get at the same kinds of structures. I can speak a little bit more about that hopefully at the end of the talk. So now there might be some people, if my good friend Kate Stanton is watching, who might say, okay, that might be all very well for syntax, which is kind of a formal theory. I've not randomly sampled here. I've taken the one theory that seems to be very formal. But what about semantics, pragmatics, phonology, other aspects of linguistics, the larger project that I was talking about? Well, of course, there are structural features of all of these fields, but whether something as strong as ontic structural realism can be applied is a much more different story. And here, the complete story, I think, and I would opine for now, is that where the structures are going to emerge are actually at the intersections and the interfaces between syntax and semantics, semantics and pragmatics, syntax and phonology. And if you have a parallel architecture, then you could have interfaces between, you know, various components while ignoring other components. And I think once you do that, you're abstracting away from the individual nature of syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and you're actually looking at the structural relationships between them. And ultimately, that's how you're going to explain linguistics as a unified field, if it can be unified. And so where I think ontic structural realism would be useful in the more complete story is actually talking about the relations between these different components of grammar. So in conclusion, I hope I've made at least an intuitive case that despite radical theory change, there's actual structural continuity between different epochs of generative grammar. And the forms grammars can take involves identifying these structural overlaps. I hope to suggest that this gives us some reason to also believe that, that structural realism can be applied to linguistics and the special sciences. Obviously, I haven't proven the rest of the special sciences. That's a job for many other people. But I think linguistics and specifically syntax make a strong case that there's a priority of structure and relation over individual objects. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. However, okay, here we go. Great. Thank you, Ryan, for this wonderful talk. We have a bit of time to discuss. Let me remind you how we are going to be proceeding. If you have a question for Ryan, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A button and just write your name. And I will promote you to the status of panelist, and then you can ask a question to Ryan directly, so that I don't have to mediate. So let me just, it takes a second for me to do that. All right, great. All right, Siddharth, you're first.
Hi, thanks. So what I'm going to say is not really a question, but just a comment and an invitation for you to reflect on that. So what struck me is that several of the themes are all sort of moving away from a formal logical way of doing things, right? So if you think about ontic structural realism, you could sort of see that as a response to this kind of Quinean view of thinking of ontological commitment as what you first order quantify over, right? And that view would be not robust to theory change. You mentioned mathematical structuralism of the Shapiro sort, and that is also a move away from the kind of set theoretic foundations of mathematics. And here, again, in linguistics, you're seeing a move away from the more sort of formal logical ways of, well, that is, I guess, maybe part of my question is that, do you see the trend in linguistics also as a move away from the more kind of mathematical logical way of doing things? Or do you think that at least in syntax, there's still that strong urge to do it in the formal logical way of doing things? And secondly, do you think that basically what we're seeing here is just this general move in the 21st century away from that kind of shadow of logical empiricism of framing things in terms of formal logic?
Thank you for that excellent question and comment about the relationship, which is exactly what the investigation is. What movement is involved with mathematical structuralism, structural realism in physics and other sciences, and then can you tell a similar story for linguistics? And I think theoretically you can. I think that sort of the move away from formalization in the early parts of generative grammar suggests that the theory was moving further away from the kinds of proof theoretic models that I described earlier. But what I think is interesting is that, or at least the claim that I'm trying to make, is that that structure has actually bound together different epochs of the linguistic project, at least in syntax. So even though theoretically moves were made towards psychology and biology, weirdly enough, when you look at when linguists were in the heyday of saying they were doing psychology, it didn't look anything like what you would find in psychology journals. It actually looked very proof theoretic still, even though the theoretical commitments had shifted. So where the ontic structural realism is coming in is to try to explain that continuity. It wasn't just abandonment of theory. There was actually some mathematical structure that was retained.
Thank you, Siddharth. Mandy, floor is yours.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you very much for that talk. So I want to ask a question, and I have to see if I can make it coherent. Basically, I want to ask you to help me understand the status of structures in syntax.
Okay.
For example, a syntactic tree. And in particular, so you sort of started out by saying, let's adopt the assumption that generative syntax is somehow about the mind-brain. For some of us who were raised on generative syntax, we like the generative aspect of the theory, but have stepped back from the claim that it is a characterization of some the mental module. Which does indeed leave it as something of a puzzle, right? What exactly these structures are supposed to be, especially when we're not thinking of language necessarily as something that inhabits the brain of a single speaker, but as a sort of public resource. So can you say something to kind of help me understand how to think about the status of these things on your view?
Yes, thank you for the invitation to return to sort of the ontological questions that I sort of tabled at the first parts of the talk. Firstly, I'm a big fan. It's nice to meet you, even virtually. Secondly, that's an interesting question. So the framework that I actually personally believe dovetails or interprets the structural move more than the mentalism of Chomsky and linguistics is taking on a little bit of the non-psychological aspects of whether it's David's nominalism, which would then suggest that the structures are actually speaking about idealized tokens in the linguistic behavior of communities. I obviously wouldn't want to go cats and postals way of suggesting that this is all sort of Platonic abstract structure, because you still have to explain the relationship between how people learn these things and share them and things like that, which at times I think the Platonists are not really interested in doing. So of course, if I'm making the claim that what's retained across generative grammar is actually not all these theoretical commitments about cognitive structure or whatever, but actually mathematical structure of grammar, I think you've sort of outed my my more formalist leanings to suggest that there's something true of the ontology of structures here. So the structural realist project actually suggests in linguistics that linguistics is about non-mental structures, and those mental structures respect aspects of those external combinations of things, but they're not to be found in the head of the speaker. So that my view is that the best place for this kind of analysis is actually not in mentalism. And that's where the sort of structural continuity comes apart from the theory, I think, because the theory obviously wants to maintain that, you know, grammars are in the head or certain strong versions of the theory, but I actually think grammars are describing something external that is related to things in the head, but not to be identified with them. I probably should have said that, but I was trying to hide that bias.
I'm glad you did say it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandy. Kate, floor is yours.
Hello, Ryan. Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it very much. So I have a few questions. One is I was really interested in this role that the pessimistic induction played and how that actually figures in practice in linguistics and in particular in grammar. So, you know, the way that you cashed it out was that, prior theories have been false. So what reason do we have to believe that future theories shouldn't share the same status? But then you did go on to point out that in syntax, many individuals inhabit kind of prior epochs and do so in a way that's kind of unashamed. Like it's not saying, well, you know, we know that we've moved on since then, but these simplified calculations are useful. And so we're going to carry on using them. It's just, you know, we can be principals and parametrists or government and binding ists and do so and be part of that research project. So the kind of linear progression that we see in the pessimistic induction doesn't seem to be exactly, at least as far as you cashed it out, mirrored in the state of the art in syntax. Do you think that means that, you know, it's even an even more pessimistic state that we should be in about linguistics? There's not as much movement as might be inspiring us to be truly pessimistic in the pessimistic induction style. So I just wanted to ask you to kind of talk a little bit about how pessimistic induction is working in syntax as opposed to how it's working in other sciences.
Thank you for that question. So in the works that I've discussed this, I take Bickerton's point, for instance, that you have generativists working in each separate phase of the general theory, if you can call it that, as extra pessimistic. It's a very strange state of affairs, because at least if you've moved from Newtonian to relativistic physics, you believe kind of relativistic physics is true of the natural world. But sometimes, as you say, you can use these calculations and they help. And then if you go the Ladyman route with phlogiston, you could even make a case for, well, these calculations are mapping onto this other true reality because they've maintained some sort of structural explanation. There's a similar pattern of argument in that structure that gives you the results and the successes that you're getting. And the case of linguistics seems, at least the way I've described it in syntax, to be a little bit more worrying, because not everybody has moved to minimalism. John Josephs at Edinburgh told me he did this little informal project once where he walked around Edinburgh's linguistics department, which is, you know, one of the best ones in the world. And he asked different people separately if they considered themselves a generativist and what they were working on. And he said the variety of explanations, of methodological commitments, it was just vast. And so I suppose where my project comes into is to say that there is a way to connect the dots. It's not going to be linear. It's not going to give you progress necessarily. It might even suggest going backwards at times. Maybe you shouldn't have left the epoch that you know, described things in government and binding or something like that. But that to me just makes the linguistics case even more interesting. So when I was speaking about how, you know, you're looking at hundreds of years of change and movement in physics, for instance, with linguistics, you see this compressed structure and you don't see complete abandonment at each case. And I think that calls for explanation as well. And I think it's because what binds somebody in a previous epoch to the current one is that they're using a similar pattern of structural explanation for explaining certain phenomena.
Thanks, Kate. I mean, if I can bring an anecdote. No, I took my linguistic seminars and classes now quite a long time ago, nearly 20 years ago, probably even more. Says a lot about me. But it was all government and binding, and minimalism wasn't even mentioned in my linguistics courses. Maybe it's because it was taught by a semanticist who basically so it was courses in syntax but taught by a semanticist. So maybe that's part of the explanation. But we didn't have I didn't have any exposure to minimalism, just government and binding and principal and parameters, really. So I had a question for you, but before I ask you, actually I had two questions. I think someone is raising a hand. Okay, let me just promote that person. And let me just ask my question, which is sort of a follow-up to Kate's question. No doubt there might be continuities in structures, and I think it's really interesting as a project to highlight them. But I also wanted to know whether you thought that was the only, or maybe even to push you a bit more, the most important aspect of continuity. If you look at the generative grammar tradition, one might think, for example, that methodology or a commitment to a set of methods is what unify 60 or 70 years of research in that tradition. One might think there's a specific distinctive style of what counts as evidence and what counts as explaining this evidence. That's also very important in explaining why people can feel they belong to the same tradition despite being committed to explanatory frameworks that are very different from minimalism. Or that keeping in mind your emphasis on structural continuity, I think that is superficially different, as different as government binding and minimalism, right? What I have in mind here is acceptability judgments as the way to collect evidence, a certain autonomy with respect to actually much of psycholinguistics. So there's in a sense a style here of data collection and explanation that seems, at least for a non-expert like me, to be unifying this historical tradition that we call generative linguistics. So how important is that? Do you agree that, but it's just not your focus, or yeah?
So I think that is the bigger picture in which the identification that I'm trying to make fits. So whether I'm in some way suggesting that there's this proof theoretic vein that goes through a lot of linguistics, that relates to a methodological style. And then what you're suggesting, I think, is that there are other components of that style. Like what confirms the grammar? Okay, we say it's the structure and the proof theory and everything like that, but what gives us the evidence for that? And that seems to have been quite consistent across different epochs as well. So I think that's the biggest story. But I also want to entertain the counterfactual that if that had changed, if say linguists start moving to full on, and this is to a certain extent, I saw a talk from a Cambridge linguist in minimalism who was talking about like doing these large-scale corpus studies and things like that, which seemed quite, out of touch with the way I had grown up in generative grammar. But she still used that data to inform things that looked a lot like sort of X-bar and phrase structure. So I think the counterfactual situation could entertain the possibility that there is even movement with the methodology. But I think you're right that is part of the story as well.
Cool, thanks. James Mara, I think you had your hand up in the discussion, or maybe that was a mistake. 1, 2, 3. Kate, the floor is yours.
Oh, here we go. Actually, so you know what? I'm going to ask this as a question. This is kind of a follow-up to what you just mentioned, and I was interested in something parallel, perhaps, that you might have anticipated from me along the semantics lines. It looks like we are seeing candidates for really mathematically different options for doing formal semantics, coming from kind of distributional semantics right in the future. So say we all decide, that nouns are vectors and adjectives are matrices. That's a marked difference from what's gone before with the type lambda calculus and variations on the kind of Montegovian project. At that point, would you say, well, the difference between those two, as it were, epochs of doing semantics is significant enough to start to ask some serious questions about whether the kind of formal structuralist project is going to survive it?
So I really should say that, Kate. Because that makes a lot of sense. But the structural realist in me is trying to find some alternative explanation for what is going on. So it depends. This might be a problem by problem case. So you might actually look at how a particular construction, a semantic construction, is analyzed in two different kinds of theories. A distributional approach certainly looks a lot different from like a type lambda construction in Montegovian semantics. But you might look at something Kitchener calls this sort of argument pattern that's used. If similar kinds of moves are made, but the methodology is slightly different, there's a different level of structural analysis that you could apply. Now, my level of structural analysis was a little bit more in your face. I wanted to say, hey, this is the same kind of mathematical structure. And your case is suggesting it's not the same mathematical structure, but they are potentially other ways of getting at a more abstract notion of structure. And I worry about that because I worry about what disconfirms such moves. And that's why I'm reluctant to suggest them. But I think there might be a story, or maybe I called myself an ontic structural realist light in this talk. So a more like heavy duty ontic structural realism might still try to account for things like that. So for instance, the challenge of model theoretic syntax in generative grammar, or the contentious claim that government and binding was already doing sort of constrainty kind of stuff, that is a worry for the view that I'm advocating, because that does seem like a different mathematical structure. And then the move that I had to make was to say, well, you can characterize the Chomsky hierarchy and the same sets of formal languages like regular languages, context-free languages, by means of model theory, weak second order monadic logic. But that's, again, abstracting to a further level of mathematical structure. And keeping all of these things distinct is one major issue with the project. I think with the semantics case, I do sense that things are moving quite in quite different directions that a picture like mine might not allow for. And that's why I said that someone like you might have thought that I was cheating a little bit to start with syntax, because syntax already sort of builds the formality into the framework.
I really like the idea of moving away from purely mathematical structure as a characterization of the appropriate kind of structure, to say that thing is being preserved.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Colin, go for it.
Thanks. Yeah. So thanks, Ryan. Like Edward, I learned my little bit of linguistics from a semanticist, and even further ago than Edouard, so I'm even more out of date on this stuff. But I'm trying to sort of understand, because some things in your talk went by a little bit quickly for me, particularly some of the ideas about ways in which the newer approaches can be proven to have, I think you said, some of the same structural properties as earlier approaches. And I'm trying to map that onto my also non-specialist understanding of, say, the relationship between relativistic physics and classical physics, where, Newtonian, where my understanding is that the sense in which the Einsteinian preserves the structure of the Newtonian is that under certain conditions, under certain constraints, to a reasonable degree of empirical approximation, you will get the same predictions out of the constrained subset of the Einsteinian structure that you get out of the Newtonian structure. Again, it's an approximation relation. Right. But what makes the Einsteinian case more, I think in that case, we can say some of the structure is preserved. The structure, though, in the Einsteinian theory is clearly different, and it has physical import because you can make predictions and verify that they are correct predictions, whereas if you try to run the Newtonian theory at those high energies and high speeds, you get the wrong predictions. So my question is, in the end, a simple one, but maybe not a simple one to answer, which is, okay, in what way is this shift, let's say, to minimalism from government and binding or whatever, similarly one where the newer theory makes novel predictions or covers cases that the other doesn't, yet under certain constraints, captures all the cases that we care about to some degree of approximation from the earlier theory? And if that analogy is completely inapt, then in what sense are we really to say that there's anything other than, if really they just match on all of the predictions and cover all the same data, in what sense are we really just talking about different theories rather than just different formulations of the same theory?
Okay, I'll try to, I think I get the thrust of the question. I'll try to be specific in where I think you're going to have this case. So you take something like the minimalist program, which many linguists will tell me, hey, that's not a theory, that's a program, it's a way of doing things. That might actually relate to Edouard's point about sort of a methodology, a methodological style. And you get these claims. Now, I think prediction is a little bit tricky to talk about when we're doing generative linguistics, but explanation might not be. So let's say that minimalism actually explains how language evolved better than government and binding, with all of these modules that would have needed to separately evolve and then connect to each other. Let's say minimalism, which starts with bare structure, sort of is a better explanation of the evolution of language. That's a controversial point, but if you'll grant it for the moment. Then I'm saying that trace theory, which was characteristic of previous theoretical persuasions in generative grammar, which postulated that when movement happened, there were little traces left behind. And that moved to minimalism that said, no, we can't have so many objects in our ontology. That's just exploding. Let's eliminate the traces and just say that these are copies of things that are moved, but you only have one object there which is, there's some work on how you exactly get a copy without duplicating and having more than one object, but that's the move that's made. It's the same style of explanation. It's the same sort of mathematical formalism to deal with movement, but now the theory is supposed to explain something like language evolution much better than its predecessor. So
that's interesting in the light of the idea of the Martian linguist, because it suggests that the Martian linguist can't even do linguistics without doing a whole bunch of biology as well. If we're going to justify one claim on the basis of its better ability to fit with what we know about the evolution of the language, but linguists, to what extent is the Chomsky notoriously sort of has thrown up his hands in the air mostly about evolution with the exception of the Hauser-Chomsky-Fitch paper, where he sort of finally admitted there might be something to it. So I'm wondering to what extent that kind of appeal to extra linguistic facts of a certain kind is captured by the kinds of, well, so right. So I'm not formulating this question very clearly, but it struck me that the theories of grammar, of syntax, were supposed to be theories about which strings are acceptable and which are not, right? Among a bunch of actual speakers. And so now to say, well, we're going to prefer this theory because it fits with another account from somewhere else about how these creatures came to be, is striking me as rather changing the subject. It's trying to capture something other than the structure that was intended to be covered by the original theory. And I suppose that's a legitimate move when you think about the way in which different sciences do constrain each other. But then it's unclear whether that extra support is something that's actually embedded in the structure provided by the formal grammar.
Right. But I was trying to answer the question of, well, what's when the theory changes and maybe makes better predictions, or in this case, maybe a better explanation of the language faculty itself, which now, and I agree with you, the subject's being changed because the idea is, well, in explaining the language faculty, it's not just about accounting for all the grammatical strings of the language, which was the agenda at certain times, but also to do it in a way that's informed by these constraints from biology or from evolutionary biology. But that's part of what the claim is, that we're doing a better job now, because clearly that biolinguistics is what we were doing all along at some stage. That's also the claims that are made. We just didn't have the tools to formulate the questions yet. And then where I fit in is just to try to say, okay, well, maybe we're doing biolinguistics, maybe we were doing psychology 20 years ago or something like that. But it seems like the kinds of accounts we're giving from a mathematical perspective are quite similar, even if our ontological commitments about things like traces or copies are shifting. So the continuity I'm suggesting is not to be found in the theory, where some people like hardline generativists might say, no. And I've heard this claim made, and I've even seen it made in print, that linguistics since the 60s was always biolinguistics, and it was always biologically informed. But, it wasn't that transparent until 1995 or something like that. And I'm making a different claim to say what has been retained is actually not the theoretical commitments, but some sort of underlying mathematical structure.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Great.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
Mike, floor is yours.
All right. So this is going to be in the subject of general philosophy of science question, because I couldn't possibly hope to say anything interesting about the linguistics, although I enjoyed hearing it. I was intrigued, and I think I appreciated the turn of phrase you had early on, which was you were gonna, I think this was your second of the two possible projects, and this was what can linguistics or what can various special sciences do for ontic structural realism? And I say intrigued by this because I guess cards on the table, two things pop to my mind. One is I prefer in my philosophy of physics work to treat physics as just as much a special science as any other. And two, I learned sort of the folk history of structural realism in sort of Worrell era, so epistemic structural realism, as a placeholder more than anything else. It was supposed to be the thing that let you thread the needle between worries about pessimistic meta-induction and no miracles arguments. And so for these two reasons, I met your claim with interest, because it's one, it asks, well, it mandates us answering the question, what ultimately are we hoping ontic structural realism will provide us? So that we can then turn around and ask, well, what can each of these special sciences do to help us in that aim or that pragmatic goal. And so I was wondering if I could push you slightly beyond the general branding that you gave, which is that you are a fan of ontic structural realism, to ask, what do you see as the goal of providing an account of ontic structural realism such that different special sciences can contribute to that goal? Does that question?
Yeah, I'll try to answer it, and you can maybe tell me if I'm a little bit off base. So that little slogan that I had, it sort of reverses the standard story about, especially in the hardline ontic structural realist literature, that you start with fundamental physics, and that's the strongest place. You get like non-individuality in quantum mechanics, and that's it's underdetermined. That's Ladyman's 1998 characterization. So you would want some sort of eliminativist theory about objects. But that's controversial, as I flagged that. And that's controversial to the extent that then you have to consider whether or not quantum mechanics does involve objects. Can they a purely relational account be given, and things like that. And that partly is just beyond my skill set to try to invest in that argument. So then the second challenge that as you flagged, is, okay, well, maybe we don't need to rely completely on fundamental physics. Or maybe your wonderful way of thinking about it, that physics is just a special science as well. Then the larger question becomes, okay, what can the special sciences do for this? And I think why I'm a fan and saying more about my fandom is that I think structural realism helps us with answering or finding some viable answers to the big question about progress in science. And I think this is something that this happens in the social sciences, in the cognitive sciences. You constantly want to know, am I doing something better? Am I doing something different to what was done 20 years ago? Am I explaining things more? And as Colin's point earlier, prediction is a nice way to get that. But in the realm that I'm talking about, prediction isn't often an element of what's going on. It's more characterization or description or explanation that's relevant. So I guess what I think all the special sciences can contribute is a larger global story about how to think about progress in science. And in my view, ontic structural realism comes quite close, at least intuitively, to directly engaging with that question.
Good. So this is, I said, intrigued and found it appealing, and that this was the answer that made me throw in the word appealing. And I wonder, so we can distinguish between two, sort of a deflationary version of what you just said and an inflationary version. And I wonder just if I can put you in one or the other box. And so the deflationary is ontic structural realism is something like a working hypothesis for for intellectual history or for historiographic methods. So we're going to embrace this as a framework and then hold ourselves to it, answering questions about the development of these disciplines in these special sciences in terms that look ontic structurally real. So that would be the deflationary, and then the inflationary one is we want more than just a descriptive narrative of the sense in which these sciences have progressed, but we want the richer notion of a way of spelling out in virtue of what they have truly progressed. And do you find yourself gravitating towards that?
I think I start with the methodological commitments of the deflationary one, and then hope that along the way insights will lead me to make stronger claims in terms of what you're describing as the inflationary one. But I worry about inflationary accounts, as you call them, because they are quite common in the philosophy of physics, at least in my reading of it, and sometimes they can make claims that the science is not always supporting. Because you're doing a little bit of your metaphysical commitments are kind of leading your way through the science. And what I like about what you call the deflationary one is you're letting the science talk first, and then you have clearly a bias or a framework to apply, but you're putting the science first as opposed to putting the metaphysics first. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for the project.
Thank you. Yeah, this was great.
Thanks, Mike. Siddharth.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. The question that I want to ask has, I guess you have sort of addressed aspects of it with Colin and Mike, but just to sort of perhaps push on it a little bit more. So, right, there's this meta project of looking at theory change in linguistics and looking at whether there's structure preserved among them. But then there's also this kind of first order project of, well, what is the right ontology of linguistics, right? If that question even makes sense, right? And as far as I understand you, you're fairly non-committable about that first order question. But so if I could put you on the hot seat, can you? So what is your? What do you really think that there's this kind of? I think you briefly mentioned that some people have a Platonist conception that there are these abstract objects that linguistics is about, or is it just a kind of like higher level description of cognition or biology? So, or how do you think what the kind of ontology of linguistics even is, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, that question does make sense to me, because if for anyone who's in my my book workshop at Pittsburgh, they know I've tried to answer that question, and sometimes it's better to be non-committal because that's a much more difficult question, and that's one that I've kind of skirted around in this talk, because I think you can sort of, as I was describing to Mike, let the science talk a little bit and then read off what's going on with the addition of your inductive bias or something. But I suppose if I'll put my controversial hat on for a second, and I think Mandy Simons also had a similar kind of push for me to lay my ontological cards on the table. I think that the picture I would favor is something that that dilutes to a certain extent a mathematical structuralist view. So mathematical structuralism here understood as an alternative to Platonism in the philosophy of mathematics. So I think if you take that on board, you can give a much more sensible epistemology than Platonism does. And then if you follow people like Parsons in identifying some sort of quasi-concreteness he talks about with relation to certain kinds of structures, I think that kicks out linguistic structures. So my ontological cards are that I'm quite partial to mathematical structuralism, but with the caveat, the major caveat, that is clearly inapplicable to something like an empirical science of linguistics, but then adding a dilution of whether it's quasi-concreteness or some respect constraint that David talks about in his book, that move would then be necessary.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. If no one has any further question, 1, 2, 3. All right. Thank you, Ryan, for this great lecture, and also thank you for everything for this really good Q&A. I think it was actually quite enjoyable. So
I think it was better than the talk.
Not at all. We hope to see most of you next week for the lunchtime talk at noon, and for the ALS lecture at 3:30 on Friday next week. All right. Have a good weekend. Bye. Thanks again, Ryan.